Hi, this is Tom for PokerVIP.com, and welcome to the fourth and final part of me reviewing John's gameplay from his bankroll challenge on Betfair. So we're going to cover the last video that he sent me, go through it in detail, and then at the end we are going to have a closing thoughts section where I'm going to go over what we've seen in all four videos and the areas I think he should be working to improve on. And just much like I have throughout the four videos, just approach it as if John was a paid client that had asked for coaching as to what I think he should be working on and ways and means in which he can do that. So with that being said, we're going to jump into the action. We're going to start off on the left-hand table with the King Queen 6-6, which John has open on the button. Totally reasonable open. We'd be doing this, in a six-handed game when we're on the button. Obviously being heads up, it's even more attractive. We get an okay flop. We have blockers to straights. It does hit calling range to an extent, but it's also going to hit our button range as well. So there's not a massive range advantage going on here. I'm going to expect to see John bet this, and he's going to pick it up a reasonable percentage of the time. Times he doesn't, he can apply pressure on further runouts. And he just bets picks up, which is an absolutely fine result. The right-hand table, he's going to wake up with single suited kings in the big blind. And just while we wait for the action, left-hand table, we're totally okay with this open. This is definitely going to be in a button open range. And on the right-hand table, we have John 3-betting the kings. I quite like this, given we're in position. If we're out of position, it's very much going to depend where the raise comes from. Against button, it's fine. Against earlier position opens, it's going to be more of an issue, just because they're going to be repping tighter ranges, and this is going to play progressively worse against the tighter and tighter ranges. And if this were a rainbow version of kings, we may be not so keen on 3-betting it, just because of its poor playability, and just play it as a pure value hand to try and hit the king. But when we've got some suits, we've got the second nut blocker of diamonds, and we do have a half flush draw. We're totally okay with 3-betting this in position and exploiting the small blinds open, which in general at micro stakes they're going to be opening a bit too wide of the small blinds. So adds a bit of credence to the 3-bet, and so we're happy with the fact he's done this. It's definitely going to be a positive win rate long term, and we get an okay flop here. With the exception of diamonds and bear jacks, it doesn't really hit calling range massively. If we replace the 4 deuce with something like a 7-5, it's going to hit the calling range far more in terms of straight synergy. But the 4 deuce is going to kind of not really have so many straights. A few exist, but very few. We do have a 3 blocker as well. So it's not the worst flop in the world. There are marginally better ones, of course, but we can't be too greedy. It's pretty good. So I'm going to expect to see John bet here. And he does. Yeah, we're absolutely fine of this. Try and get value off Jack X, try and get value off flush draws, try and get value, off just, some overpairs or even possibly underpairs. The jacks that just don't believe, a hand like queens, which on flop we're very happy with, and turn less so. And, possibly even 10s, 9s, maybe get a really weird straight draw like 6-5-3 to call. Just try and exploit value out of stuff that can be there. We're just going to bet pick it up pretty often as well, which is far from the worst result from our point of view. Turns, not exactly the best turn in the world. The queen's going to hit their calling range fairly frequently the times they have a jack. Given we block the king, there aren't going to be so many king-jack combos in the villain's range. So we're more looking at like queen-jack 10-8 type hands. Some ace queen-jack, although they could very easily 4-bet, but probably don't when out of position. So it is going to hit our opponent's range more than we would like. There is still a reasonable chance we're ahead, but the times we're ahead versus a jack or a bear flush draw, which we can't really extract value from. So I'm absolutely fine with John just checking here and trying to play rivers, which I think is probably going to be the best line here long term. And that's exactly what he does. So he gets the river, and we've really got to consider sort of like what we're doing on this river. Personally, I like the check, and it's not necessarily because I think I'm beat, although that is a small consideration. It's more from the point of view that the stuff I'm beating is never paying off, and I don't really want to value myself against some random 2-pair that happened to get there on river, like a 4-5 that shouldn't be there but somehow is because they just don't believe our 3-bet range. Jack 5 maybe that's just a Jack 10-9 5 type hand that's hit the dangler. That kind of rubbish that always annoys you when you value bet and get called. By a better hand, a weird better hand, but a better hand than nonetheless. if this board had come like a four or a deuce on the river, yeah, we can talk about potentially value betting our kings. A king we can also value bet. And we're only ever really worried about getting check raised there by a really greedy ace-10, and a check raise there would be crazy nutted. Excuse me. So yeah, we're okay with just checking back here if our opponent's willing to let us, and they are going to bluff 8% of the time. But given they haven't led turn, the bluff doesn't look super strong, given just about every draw's missed, with the exception of ace-3, which I guess could exist. 6-3 we're not so worried about. It's kind of like if he has it, that's just unfortunate, but it really shouldn't exist in range. So if we get led into, we can talk about potentially bluff catching. As I said, Queen Jack's literally the only hand we're really concerned about, and that can quite easily lead turn. As it is when checked, totally fine with this check back. I just don't think we get value from betting. And he's going to show up the best hand, which is not a massive surprise, but I don't think he could have won any more. So, I'm happy with the way he's played that. We're going to focus on the right-hand table. And we have the Queen Jack 10-4, and the only point to say here is that we think it's a pretty good fold here that he makes. It's going to be in a big blind defending range, and the reason for that is that we're closing action, and we've kind of already invested more, so we're going to be defending more from the big blind than we ever would be in a cold calling range. There's a huge difference between a cold calling range and a big blind defend range. I've been talking about defending sort of in heads up spots, around 50% of the time, whereas a cold calling range, I wouldn't even dream of doing that. And the reason is because we've already invested. For all we're out of position, we are getting a cheaper price than the 2-to-1 we're being offered. In just about every other position, it doesn't happen to be the small blind. And we're also closing action, so we know exactly how much it's going to cost us. With the exceptions where it's like a 3-bet before, in which case, we should never even think about cold calling. So that point is somewhat irrelevant. So the point I'm trying to make is cold calling and big blind defending ranges are going to be very, very different. Cold calling ranges are going to verge very heavily on the side of value, and big blind defending ranges are going to be much wider. Multi-way, they're going to be tighter, is going to be sort of more like 35 to 40%, just because we have to worry about multi-way considerations and how well does a hand play multi-way. Whereas heads up, our hands can be a bit more polarized because we only have to worry about one player. So post-flop playability, while still an issue, it's not such a massive consideration, just because there's fewer people in the pot, essentially. So flush draws, straight draws have significantly more value than they would do in a multi-way spot where we're only really focusing on the very nuttest of flush draws and the very nuttest of straight draws. So yeah, just a quick point about what I've been talking about in previous videos about cold calling and big blind defending ranges. We're going to focus on the left-hand table. John has decided to go for the 3-bet, and yeah, we're not a fan of this. This is just going to be far too wide. Whenever someone sort of talks about a hand being double suited, it immediately conjures up images of strength, and in this instance, calling a hand double suited here isn't really telling the whole story, because one of the suits we have happens to be 4 high. So the way we really should think about this hand is that it's basically King Jack, a couple of danglers, and a couple of blockers. It's almost a single suited hand with a couple of danglers and a couple of blockers. When we talk about that in terms of hand strength, we obviously get a very different image in our mind. We suddenly think, oh, it's the 2-card hand. That's quite weak in Omaha. The hand isn't working together, and that's the way we should be thinking about it. And when it comes to sort of describing hands, I'm quite pragmatic about these sort of things. And if that's the way that you need to think about a hand like this in order to get you to fold it, then that's absolutely fine, as long as you get the end result. Then how you got there in terms of your thought processes, as long as they're logical, and underpinned by rational reason, then that's absolutely fine. So the 3-bet here is just going to be a losing play long term. We're not a fan of it at all. We also have to worry about action back if that happens to happen. This hand is just going to play appallingly. And I believe that is the situation we are faced with, that we do indeed get 4-bet. Yeah, so the 4-bet comes in, and what is a bad 3-bet hand has just basically found the absolute not worst situation possible. So we put this into Odds Oracle as to what was going on math-wise in this spot. So the first thing to bring across, I put in a 40% button range. Now, people can have a 50% button range. so it could be a little looser. The point is actually in hot and cold equity, you're not doing that well. You know, and as we've touched on before, hot and cold equity is far from the only you know, the only factor here. You know, hot and cold is only going to really refer to, you know, if we're all in and we you know, just ran the maths. It's not going to touch on concepts like how do we realize the equity that we have here. And as you can see, the 40% range actually has really good flop equity distribution versus us. This is representing what that 40% range can flop like against us. And as you see, it's going to flop the 33% required, you know, about 75% plus, which is, you know, a pretty staggeringly high number, to be honest with you. So not only are we actually behind it, but we're behind a range that really continues very well versus this hand, and we're out of position. So it's pretty much a nightmare scenario from that point of view. So not only do we have less equity, we're also significantly less likely to realize it than the range. Now, if we plugged in a 50% range, it's going to be slightly more favorable towards us, but it's still not going to be so favorable that this is a good spot. So we plugged in what I thought a 4-bet range would look like, which is around 10% of range, which is going to be around 25% of his opening range if we assume it's 40%, which seems somewhat reasonable. And again, not only do we have an equity problem, which is rather significant, we also just don't flop especially well in this spot. You know, okay, the overall curve is not terrible, but it drops off really heavily at the start of the hand, which is kind of just illustrating the fact that it doesn't flop really well that often. It flops middling quite a lot, although, you know, not as much as the opponent's range is doing. But, you know, it's not going to absolutely crush, you know, very many boards at all, which is going to be a significant problem. You know, we're never going to have 100% equity, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. You know, and you can see that, you know, by the time we get to 10%, we're already below the 70% equity sort of scenario. You know, with a 10% frequency, which is quite a drop off. So it's just illustrating this hand is not doing, you know, all that well. You know, I put in a 50% range on the button, and we're still actually behind it, somewhat staggeringly. And it's still flopping well. The 50% range is still flopping well. It's not flopping quite as well as the 40% range, but it's still flopping pretty well. So all in all, we're not in love with this spot at all. You know, we have a situation where I think it's pretty clear fold. So the 4-bet is just going to play pretty poorly. We're out of position, and there's a pretty real chance that either our king, our jack, or nightmare scenario both happen to be blocked. Potentially flush draws are blocked, so, you know, we have the reverse implied odds on those. So we're just going to plug in what we would expect to flop like with our interactive hand rankings in Odds Oracle, which is probably not going to come out with a fantastic result. In fact, I've run this before, so it won't. So again, we're just going to bring it across. We're going to remove the equity graph. That's kind of useless for this, but we're just going to show how well do we expect to flop in this scenario. And hang on, that's previous spot. And yeah, we're going to run it. And you know, this is versus an 8% range, but, you know, 8 and 10 is not going to make an enormous difference here. Got the stats up from a previous problem that I was running. And yeah, we just see we're not really flopping strong very often, which kind of also ties in with what the flop equity distribution was telling us. That we're going to flop nothing quite frequently, and that, you know, we're going to be flopping, you know, a lot of third pairs, a lot of second pairs, which is the problem with having 4 and 3 in the hand. And then we're going to really, you know, really not be flopping particularly strong, particularly often. I mean, when you add these 3 stats together, you know, we're going to be flopping nothing or incredibly weak hands around 2/3 of the time, it's about 65%, which is, I mean, pretty damn high, to be honest with you. You know, it's kind of staggering. I mean, for the sake of completeness, we'll put in the 10% range, and it's going to have very much the same answer. It's going to be, I mean, a percentage or so either side. But it's just going to really illustrate that not only do we have the problem of like pure equity, but we also have a hand that's just not flopping particularly well in this spot. So yeah, really hope that John just folds this, because it's just going to play horribly, and we're just going to be posed with all sorts of issues. He does elect to make the call, and we have one of the scenarios where we flop particularly poorly. We did, in fact, manage to flop bottom pair, So he goes for the check, totally reasonable bottom pair. And we're going to come back to the right hand table when we've completed this hand, because that does merit discussion as well. And kind of bizarrely in this spot, we actually get the button who's 4-bet checking back, which is really, really, really kind of bizarre. If you think about a 4-bet range, this really should crush it. You know, the type of hands we're looking at that have missed this are kind of like ace, king, jack, you know, single suited or double suited, king, jack, 10, 9s. You know, like the queen has some synergy with a hand in that they can improve on some turns, but you know, they're not loving this flop, far from it. And John, by calling, is kind of, he has somewhat of a wide range, and he does have some queen X's, you know, in his range, and some kings for that matter. So the first thing I think he actually that does well in this hand is the turn. He's got a check to him, and he's turned about as good as he can. He's managed to turn the second nut flush draw, he's turned an open ender, and he still has bottom pair. I love the lead. I think that he's now in a spot where, given the price, he's just going to have to call off anyway, so he might as well bet, exploit the fold equity that he has. I mean, let's remember that he still has bottom pair here. So, you know, it's absolutely fine for him to just bet here. You know, if we're talking about one of the hands we just mentioned, like the ace, king, jack, 10, that's just made a better pair than us, so getting it to fold's fantastic. And yeah, you know, we're fine with him just you know, just picking this up. I think if you're going to size like this, you might as well jam, which is exactly what he's going to do here. And he's going to win it, which is kind of unusual given that he managed to win a spot that he probably really shouldn't have done. But I think this kind of also really, you know, illustrates like a general concept within John's game, which is that pre-flop he makes quite a lot of mistakes, but post-flop he's actually playing reasonably well. You know, perhaps, you know, he's certainly not GTO and perfectly, but he's playing okay. And you see that quite a lot with quite a lot of Hold'em players, you know, who play to a good standard, which John has. You know, they understand ranges, they understand, you know, what boards are hitting opponents, what aren't, you know, what certain actions mean. And so they're quite intuitive as to what they should be doing post-flop, but their pre-flop decision-making is putting them in awkward post-flop spots, just because, you know, they haven't really got a concept of what pre-flop hand strength, you know, they should be playing. So we're going to skip back to the right-hand table, which is, first off, we get a limp under the gun from someone that we later discover as a fish. I don't know if John knows that he's a fish at this point, but he certainly does by the end of the video. And he goes for the ISO with a rainbow disconnected junky hand. And, you know, this is just a flat-out terrible flop, terrible hand, sorry. You know, it's awful from the point of view of equity, and it's pretty awful in terms of playability. It would actually be pretty difficult for me to describe a particularly positive aspect of this hand, to be totally blunt and honest with you. So, yeah, we're going to illustrate with Odds Oracle, again, interactive hand stats. How often are we going to flop with this hand? And as you can see, we are going to flop top pair and better a startlingly low percentage of the time. First off, we can't flop flush. We can't actually hit any flushes. We can't hit any flush draws of any variety. And the times we make pairs, they're very unlikely to be top pair just because the highest card we have is a 9. So when we're thinking about pre-flop decision making, you know, I'm going to borrow liberally from Jane Andes here, that we should really be thinking about a hand as having 3 components. The first of it is high card strength. There's a reason aces are so strong is, you know, they are the highest pair, they are the highest cards. So we want high cards, we want connectivity, and we're really looking for connectivity to the medium and high degree. You know, hands with 5s and 3s and deuces, you know, we're making fewer straights, and they're likely to be the lower end of the straight. So we're more thinking sort of towards the middle and top part of the deck on that one. And suitedness, and again, the higher the suit, the better strength the connectivity has. And we're the suitedness has, sorry. And we're really thinking about a hand requiring 2 or preferably more components, really, dependent on position, of course. You know, the exception is if you happen to get a spot where you can get aces in, you should always do that because you will always have an equity advantage just about. But, you know, we should always be looking for what components, you know, does this hand have. Now, if we go back to the kings that John bet, you know, about a minute ago in sort of a real-time video, he had the high card strength and he had the suitedness. Now, he didn't have the connectivity with the 7-3, but that's fine. He had 2 of the elements and he had position. This hand has nothing. We don't have high card strength. The connectivity is just 2-card connectivity. I mean, okay, I guess we can hit the 6-7 straight, but, you know, when we're talking about connectivity, we're really talking about hands working together, not, miracles. And there's no suitedness whatsoever. So it's basically not ticking any of the boxes, and as a result, it's going to do terribly. So we're going to run the tape, and it's going to get followed around to Nilo, who's going to go for a call. So we're talking about the 6-7, and he's actually managed to hit the 6-7, somewhat amazingly. So he's managed to pop in an incredibly large straight draw. There were a couple of issues straight off the bat. The first is that this really doesn't hit much of a raising range. So while he has actually hit it, he doesn't really have range advantage. So, he can get played back at in a spot where he has a strong hand, but not so strong that he wants to get all the marbles in. And secondly, he has to worry about dirty outs in the form of the clubs. So he's happy, but he's not overjoyed. That being said, if you are going to play this hand, you kind of have to see about this board because it's probably about as good as you can get. So that's exactly what he's going to do, and he's going to get called. Now, when he gets called, we're going to start thinking, okay, our opponent does potentially have some 8-9 straight draws, can have some flush draws, can have some pairs and flush draws, the 6 and the 7 with a nut flush draw type hand. And our opponent can occasionally show up with something like kings and queens, potentially. So we get to the ace of hearts on the turn, and John is going to go for the check. Now, the check is fine if you are just flat out giving up, which is far from the worst option in this spot. The ace is going to hit our range more than our opponents. We're going to have more aces. We can very credibly rep a hand such as ace high clubs in this spot. So it's fine. This check is fine as long as we shut down every time we miss. We're playing it for the pure equity of the straight draw, which is okay. I mean, that, it's not a good scenario to be in, but given it's a scenario that we've had presented to ourselves, it's okay. But we very much have to have a plan in this hand. If we're betting, we have to be prepared to bet rivers, of the heart variety. If we check, we have to be prepared to give up. Bet rivers of the club variety, rather than hearts. So we fast forward it, and off pops the Queen of Hearts. And John decides to go for a bet here. Now, this is just going to be flat out weird. Let's think about what we're actually repping here. So we have a real issue here, and the issue is that if we had a backdoor flush draw, there's very high probability that we bet turn with it. It's very weird for us to think, that we'd basically turn the best card for our hand and check. Bear in mind as well that the turn is the ace of hearts. So in effect, we'd have been drawing with a king high hand and turned an ace that we can rep ourselves and have turned equity with. What is the probability of us checking and shutting down here? Very low. So by betting, what are we repping? Well, we're repping busted 8-9, busted clubs, possibly 3 queens, maybe. I guess that could be there. I'm not even sure ace queen bets here. Probably not to that sizing. So the range, or a really weirdly played backdoor flush, which is going to represent a very small part of range, and I think our opponents are just going to call off and sigh if they happen to see it, basically. So we're repping a pretty polarized range, and it's polarized towards rubbish. So yeah, we're not a fan of this bet. I think if he checks turn, he has to check river and just give up. As it is, he is going to get called, and he gets called by what is actually a very strong hand that flop to pair with a second nut flush draw turned turned top 2. I would be making a note that this guy limped this under the gun. It's not something I wouldn't expect to limp under the gun anyway, but certainly not from a hand this strong, so that would be something I would be making a note of instantly. Jack 9-5-3, we're okay with the fold on the button. Higher kind of variants of this slightly disconnected 2 Broadway hand, like King Queen 9-6, King Queen 8-5 with a suit. We'd be firing that, but this is right at the bottom of the range, so we're totally cool with the fold. Likewise, we're absolutely fine with the fold on the right hand table when it gets opened in front of us. Just not going to play that well. So the left hand table, John is going to get open into with a reasonably okay hand to defend with, but bear in mind what we talked about in terms of big blind defense. Ace Jack 5-5 is going to play reasonably well. Obviously, dream scenario, we prefer to have the nut flush rather than Jack high flush, but it's going to be a reasonable defend when he gets around to it. and when I hit the play button, which will be handy. So yeah, we're going to have the small blind open into us, and this is an absolutely fine defend. And we flop okay. We flop top pair. We have a reasonable kicker. We have some back doors. So yeah, gets bet into. Makes a reasonably good call. It's going to be probably profitable long term, not massively, but it's doing okay. Our opponent's also going to shut down a decent chunk of the time because bluffing people off top pair and low stakes PLO is an expensive and thankless task. So yeah, 4 comes off. Bear in mind we're now blocking the straight. It doesn't really exist massively, but if it exists in anyone's range, it's going to exist in ours. And when check 2, I'm going to be using this type card as a bet really. We do possibly have the best hand. It's unlikely that someone's checking 2 pair in this instance. The only hand that we're really worried about our opponents checking that happens to be better than ours is the ace queen. And we can deny some equity to king X. We can charge flush draws. We can extract value from worse aces, although that's a bit more iffy, but it can still happen. And we can just check through on just about all runouts on the river and just attempt to take the pot if we happen to get called. And we are not going to get called that often, really. I mean, once someone checks this turn, we're just expecting them to give up. So we've got the green light, and I would be betting here. John has, however, decided to check. And he faces quite a difficult decision on the river when he gets potted into. And yeah, so given the way he's played the hand, he's kind of artificially kept his range somewhat by checking. His villain's not exactly repping much, although, I mean, I guess King 9 and some weird 2 pairs have come in. He has bluff catcher, but it's not a fantastic bluff catcher, and I think this is the kind of spot you're trying to avoid by just betting turn. You don't have to bet pot on turn, you can bet something around 60% of pot, and you're going to charge yourself a far lower price on the turn than your villain will charge you on the river. So you're just basically attempting to get to showdown by betting turn. Which I think is a reasonable route to go here. It's not a pure blocker bet. It is also a value bet on turn. It's kind of like a merge play. But overall, we're happy with that line than suddenly facing pot-sized bets on rivers with 1 pair and working out exactly where we are. As it is, John goes for the fold. I'm absolutely fine with the fold. He needs a pretty good read to know that the guy's completely bluffing, which it's weird if he was. So, yeah, we would have played the turn different, but on river, I think it's fine. It's left on table again. Folded 7s is entirely reasonable. Big blind defend, small blind less so. And yeah, as we've touched on before, there's just a big difference in cold calling ranges when we're closing, and big blind ranges where we're closing action. So yeah, we're okay with that. So right hand table, he's going to defend the kings. I'm actually pretty happy with the defend. I don't think the hand's like crazy nutted to start 3-betting it under the gun raise, albeit it's 4-handed table, but still, it's going to have some flop issues given the fact the deuce and the 9 are not massively connected. So it plays reasonably well as a call. It does also give your calling range a bit more strength when you show down with stuff like this. Yeah, I think it just has playing this hand out of position in a 3-bet spot can prove somewhat problematic at occasions with the limited kind of ways to improve. So yeah, we're fine with this call pre. As it is, he's just flopped the absolute Jesus out of the spot, and now it's a question of how do we extract value. So he elects to go for the call on flop, which I think is absolutely standard, absolutely fine. We're now almost playing the hand as a bluff catcher, just because it's kind of difficult for our opponent to have much here. Barring Queen X, which we can extract value from on later streets, we're really trying to get someone to either improve on turn to flush draw, straight draw, which are drawing dead, but can still bet, or they make a weaker full house of some variety. So yeah, we're just trying to find ways to allow people to take a few cards off and cooler themselves, and then pay us off. So we're absolutely a-okay with calling this. He goes for the check, and our opponent's going to bet again. Our opponent bets half pot. So John decides to go for the raise here, and he's raising, I assume, because he has now got the belief that his opponent has queen when he bets twice. Now, his opponent has kind of sized down a bit, although, a good player would do that with Queen X, and we really have no read on this guy. So it's really a question of, do we raise river, or do we allow him to continue on river and potentially not get a street of value. I'm okay with the raise. I think if we raise, however, it is very nutted and we really, really want to size down. So the sizing John actually picks, if we run the tape, is he goes for $6. He thinks about it. He thinks about potentially making it 5, which is the sizing I would have gone for, and this is the reason why. If we look at the sizing here, if his opponent calls 6, there is going to be the better part of 15 in the middle of the pot. He has 12 back effective. If we make it 5, there's going to be 14 in the middle. He's going to have 13.5 back. He can still stack him on the river, but he's pricing somebody in. He's also making the hand look a little weaker, so he can possibly induce a bit. Okay, his play on the turn here does make the river sizing somewhat smaller, but to be honest, the difference between like 90% pot and 95% pot and river is really not going to make a difference into someone's calling range, but making it smaller on the turn potentially will. Now, you can go too far if you start min-raising them. People just think it's crazy nutted, but you just put them in the awkward spot where they get such a good price that they can talk themselves into making a misplay. And that's what we'd be trying to do here. So it's a very small thing to pick on. And I love the fact that he hasn't potted. I think if he pots, it's scream strength, and he's basically chasing everyone out of the pot. So from that point of view, he's played it well. But I'd even size down just a little smaller, just to really allow people some rope to go and hang themselves with. But yeah, anyway, so he goes for the check raise, and unfortunately, from his point of view, he's going to get the fold. I like the concept of the turn check raise. Yeah, again, that's going to be very player dependent as to how often do you think your opponent's going to fire off, how often they're going to barrel river, how prone are they to calling raises, and all those sort of variables are going to factor into your decision making. So we get a couple of hands going on here. So the first one we're going to touch on is on the right-hand table, the Queen 10-5-5. We're okay with raising this. It's towards the bottom of what our disconnected pair range would be. Hands like Jack 10-3-3 you wouldn't be raising, for example. And the Queen 10-5-5 is going to be like towards the bottom of it. We wouldn't be raising like 9-8-5-5, for example, or 10-8-5-5. Just purely for the value of the high card, the Queen, it just slightly tips it. And when we talk about ranges like this, there's certainly grey areas when it comes to these sort of ranges. If you think of it as sort of like your black is you get dealt quads, your white is you've got double suited aces. This is really going to be that grey area in between as to where exactly do you put the threshold. And I would probably just about put this on the right side of being profitable, but it's a fine fold. Left hand table, we're going to be raising just about every double paired hand on the button, so we're absolutely fine with this. And yeah, just a profitable raise long term. As this, he's going to just skip it through. So we're going to skip the video a little bit. Fast forward it to here, and in fact, we're going to go back a few seconds, I think. Because I think we have missed one hand. I know. So the 10-10-5-6, absolutely fine open. So there's not really much to be said about this hand, other than the fact that it's interesting from the point of view of what really happened, and that is that I think John plays it well by checking through, but the hands that get shown down are very surprising, and this is just a point to say that I would be making a note of this instantly. So on the left-hand table, the Queen Jack 8-4 single suited. With the suited king, we'll be defending this. If we're defending a 50% range, this is going to definitely fit into it. Even with a 40% range, we're going to be 45% range, even 40% range, we're going to be defending this. Multi-way, it has far more problems, so we're going to be far more reticent about defending it multi-way. But in a heads-up spot, especially in a three-handed game, this is going to be a defend, and one we make reasonably happily. So we run the tape on the sixes, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. That gets checked through, and the opponent shows up with a double paired single suited aces, which is just absurd, frankly. I mean, that's like as big a slam dunk 3-bet as you'll ever see. So we've been making a note that this guy is incredibly passive pre, and just been noting things like that in general. So I'm going to fast forward, just skip to the left-hand table. So John did give me a bit of warning about this hand. He did say he was a bit embarrassed to see it played back, and so we're going to break it down. Well, the first thing to say is that the double suited tens we are going to be saying is a far too loose of a 3-bet. It's just not going to play particularly well, especially sort of lower stakes like this. I think the bottom of like what a double suited single paired hand would be as a 3-bet. From the small blind would be something like King, Jack, Jack 7, where the King is one of the suited cards. Even that at PLO 20 might be a bit loose just because people play very loose and there's going to be the prospect of more multi-way situations occurring, and that hand's going to play better in a heads-up scenario. But that would be as bottom as I would go in terms of like where I'd be 3-betting, a double suited single paired hand like that. So yeah, it's just gonna flop pretty poorly. Yeah, not a 3-bet we're a fan of. So we're just going to run the tape, and then we are going to break out some maths as to exactly what occurs in this situation. As we see, John is making a note here, which is good to see. And yeah, nightmare scenario for us with the tens. We get 4-bet. So the first thing to say is that this is a absolutely atrocious scenario for us, and it's going to play particularly poorly in a 4-bet spot. The reason being, it's a fairly general point that if you have a pair in your hand and it's not aces in a 4-bet spot, you're kind of a bit handicapped by the fact that 2 of your cards can only hit 2 outs effectively. So you've got that much more sort of less equity that you can hit on flops. So yeah, pairs in general are going to defend particularly poorly. I mean, tens really poorly, and they're not even connected tens. If we're being really optimistic of what we could flop with tens. So yeah, we're just going to run some illustrate some maths. If we assumed what a 50% value button open range was, yeah, double suited tens is ahead, but it's super marginal and just really not worth doing. Like, there's such a small edge, we don't even need to exploit it, frankly, especially at these low stakes. If we just play a value heavy game, we're just going to print money, and trying to getting ourselves in these kind of scenarios is pretty disastrous. So when we approach what we should be calling in 3-bet and 4-bet spots, we want to approach it from the point of view of BBs per 100. And the first point to make is, if we're calling 3-bets and 4-bets, we are not going to be making money. What we're saying is we are losing less money than if we fold. So in this instance, we're basically saying, can I make a call which is going to be more profitable than minus 230 big blinds per 100? Sorry, minus 11.5 big blinds. Apologies. So yeah, that's the question. Is a call here going to be more profitable than minus 115 big blinds per 100? I really struggle to see how it is. We're going to be losing about I'm going to be losing 11.5 big blinds by folding. So 1,000 big blinds per 100 ish. This spot, it really isn't going to turn up particularly often, so we really don't have to be balanced. So yeah, it's just not an instance for us to get particularly interested or involved in. I think we just fold and just sort of take it on the chin. Especially we're also out of position as well, which is the other consideration to put in. So yeah, I mean, also to illustrate the point, we're going to run some interactive hand rankings as to how well this hand is going to flop, and we are going to be somewhat surprised by just how poorly it will flop. Just basically because it's quite a polarized hand, even when double suited. It's just, we're not going to have a particularly good hand that often. Even when we have an overpair, when we're facing significant action, it's not going to be an overpair that's good. So yeah, we're just not flopping well enough. Yeah, we're going to flop occasional some flush draws, but they're not going to be nut flush draws. So yeah, we would be folding this pretty readily. John elects to go for the call, gets a pretty shocking flop from his point of view, really. It's going to connect with some 4-bet ranges. A lot of them are going to have the ace-king draw. A lot of higher pairs are going to potentially have the flush draw. Blockers are basically non-existent here because the stacked pot is so small that blockers are really not going to play any impact in this spot. It's the other problem with calling with this kind of hand is the stacked pot ratio. We have marginally more than a pot size bet back, so the SPR is about 1.5. You know, hands like this are just going to play terribly in those kind of instances. So yeah, we put in you know, how tens the 10 hands would be doing against like a 15% range, which I think is probably reasonable as to what a 4-bet range would be. We could, if we went even tighter, the result would be even worse. And we asked the question, how often do we have the nut high? It's under we're just over 0.1%, and that's really to illustrate that we very rarely make a nut hand here. Now, granted, it is a 4-bet spot, so sort of like really nut potential, I guess, is slightly less important. You know, hand rankings change when the SPR is influenced, but yeah, we're basically drawing to a weak hand, you know, in an SPR spot that doesn't favor us, out of position. So John does probably the least worst option here, which is that he's in a scenario where he probably has to call off with the value of the flush draw, and if you're going to call off, you might as well jam it and try and exploit what limited fold equity you have. If you can get like bare kings, bare aces to fold here, then you know it's fantastic from your point of view. Whether you do get those hands to fold is questionable, and I think given the SBR, you probably don't actually. They're probably going to be very unhappy about life given the very wet, coordinated part of the board, but they're probably still just like stubborn calling off, you know, especially if they have like a king 10 draw or something along those lines with it. So yeah, I mean, it's going to work a limited percentage of the time, but it is going to be a better play than just check calling. So he's going to get this all in on the flop. And unfortunately, he's going to kind of get slow rolled a bit, to be truthful with you. You know, his opponent jams. His opponent happens to have aces, a jack blocker, and the nut flush draw. I mean, why he was taking all that time with the SBR being what it was, I mean, he should have frankly beaten him into the middle of the pot on that one. And yeah, this is the nightmare scenario for John where, you know, he's up against a pair with a higher flush draw and he's just absolutely screwed. So yeah, not much more needs to be said. Very unsportingly, his opponent just turns him dead. I don't think his opponent really understands how you're meant to run in 4-bet spots. You're not meant to hit a set, but yeah. It is what it is in the spot that could have been completely avoided, I think. So we're going to move to the right-hand table. John's going to 3-bet the kings, the connected kings, and you know we have suitedness to go with. Love the 3-bet. We have a very strong hand pre, and we have post-flop potential as well. So you know, it's really ticking all the boxes, and yeah, we love the 3-bet, especially against someone who apparently is a fish and is going to play like pretty loose anyway. Flop's about as good as he can. What I would say here is you could probably size down to more like half pot, maybe even smaller than half pot. You're really trying to pull people into this pot, really allow them to overplay hands like 6, 7, 8, allow them to overplay 2 pairs, allow them to overplay like even 8x that's trying to draw to a second pair and doesn't know he's drawing dead. So yeah, we're just trying to pull people in the pot and try and exploit what we can on what is a very, very dry board. So I would size down a bit, especially against a fish who's likely to just do something weird. So that's what I would take from this. Unfortunately, he's not going to fold anyway. Left-hand table, the ace-9-5 deuce would be open given the nut flush potential. Button open is absolutely fine. And yeah, unfortunately with kings, he's just going to pick it up with top set. So John's going to open a double suited ace with beautiful connectivity, absolutely fantastic hand, love the open. He's going to get 3-bet of the tiniest variety, which, you know, if you're going to be 3-betting, you should want to be 3-betting as much as you can. You want to alter the SPR as much to your advantage as you possibly can by, you know, bloating the pot and, you know, lowering SPR so you can put progressively more money in and you basically try and commit people on flops. You know, as it is, the guy's gone tiny. It's very much looking like he's not the world's sharpest player. And yeah, so John decides to call. Love the call. Don't need to bloat this pot at all with a hand that plays very well post flop. It's almost like a pulling hand, but definitely on the stronger side of pulling hand. So like if we happen to get opened into, this would have been an absolutely fantastic 3-bet just because of the hand strength and the playability of the hand post flop. But in this scenario where we've got 3-bet, you know, if we 4-bet, we're rarely getting action off worse. So he goes for the call, and something really weird is going to happen, which is that Dorix is going to put in the back raise. So when the opponent back raises here, we're pretty much just going to say he's got aces. I mean, I really don't see what other hands he does this with, to be totally honest with you. Snap call by the fish, and John's got a decision. So it's very awkward. I ran some maths on this, and I was a bit, to be honest, I was a bit surprised. Um, so the first thing to say is, if we were in a heads-up spot against a 5% range, and I've given the four better a very liberal 4% range, we could even go tighter here. We could put it in as like 2.5% range if we wanted, and that would probably be pretty reasonable to be totally frank with you. That would be pretty standard. You know, but I gave him a 5% range. Maybe that's a bit kind. And you see we're behind, not surprisingly. And it's kind of like just a general point that when you get 3-bet and you're in or 4-bet and you have an ace high hand, 4-bets especially, the hands are going to play particularly badly just because their range is so ace dominant. If we actually while this is going, just plug in what a 3% range looks like. We see the drop off in equity enormously, and someone's going to be dealt with aces 2.5% of the time. So this is still going to contain the odd kings combo just for the sake of completeness. But you see we progressively get worse and worse and worse, and have the playability issues on the turn, where we need to hit something pretty massive to continue. Multi-way, we ran the maths on that, and I was actually pretty surprised by this. Amazingly, so I gave the overcaller like a 5 to 12% range. He can't have the top part of range. He would have 5-bet got it in. So amazingly, we don't actually have the 2-to-1 required. I was actually really surprised by that. I thought we would. Put my hands up and say I didn't quite expect that result. But I totally get why he's calling. It's a hand that's got quite a lot of potential. So I mean, if he managed to find a fold here, I'd be pretty impressed and stunned, and I would have been surprised, to be honest with you, as well. It's not a fold I would have made hands up. I would have made a marginally losing call. And yeah, it's absolutely fine. He's flopped a pair and a gut shot here. A pair and an open ender, sorry, gut shot to the nuts. And his opponent's just potted. So he's got a decision here. Basically, if he knows he's against exactly aces without the flush draw, he's getting 43% roughly. In which case, it's probably just about a call, given he's getting 2-to-1. The problem is his opponent's also going to have some flush combos mixed in there, and against those, he's well and truly stuffed. We also have to consider just how strong his opponent's range is looking when he's just casually potted into 2 people. So, he's never in a spot where he's ahead, and it's just a question of how far behind he is. So I'm absolutely behind this fold that he makes. I think it's a good disciplined fold. And yeah, happy with that. It's a bit frustrating to make it, but it's definitely the right play. So on the right-hand table, we get the Queen Jack 6-5. John makes a defend, perfectly reasonable defend, and gets a pretty good flop, to be honest with you. He's got second up flush draw and gut shot. And when check 2, he goes for a bet, which, yeah, absolutely fine with that. His opponent's really cap range by checking. John has a good amount of equity himself, so yeah, we're a fan of this bet. It's going to pick it up a decent chunk of the time. He actually gets snap called, which is kind of weird. So he can choose to bet the turn here. Now he's picked up the straight draw as well. By betting, he's probably going to remove the bear king X's that do not have the 2 pairs in there. They haven't improved. So yeah, he's he could potentially even maybe fold out the ace high club flush draw. That maybe be a bit optimistic against a fish, but it's possible. If he goes on the large side. So in general, I'd be all right with betting turn. I think he's probably not done so because he's playing someone who's playing really loose, and you don't really want to kind of reward someone for calling every combo by bluffing into them. And I can understand that. I have notes on people where basically I don't, quote unquote bluff them. I just really widen my value range, because if someone's calling with every 2-pair combo, and in some instances even just top pair combos, then we're going to value bet really wide, and the only time we're going to be sort of bluffing is when we've got crazy amounts of equity, when I flopped a 13 card straight draw with a nut flush draw, in which case I'm happy to get it in. So John elects to check back and just play the equity at the pot. Rivers second nuts, gets checked, goes for value. I might size down a little bit, but yeah, he's absolutely fine on that one. Double suited tens, fine with the open, and pretty terrible flop. It's absolutely fine for him to just give up here. which I believe is what he's going to do. So this is an interesting hand on the right-hand table. Opens double suit fives. That's a pretty good button open. You know, he's definitely in range. And he gets an iffy flop, to be truthful with you. So he's going to elect to c-bet, and he's basically just got middle pairs and back doors. Now, his fives block, you know, some low straight draw combos. His queens block some queen jack 10 combos. So there is some blocking potential, but there's far more blocking potential on the low end of this, which is less likely to draw anyway. So I'd actually be all right with checking and just realizing equity, but I think betting is probably this, you know, it's the second best option, but not by an enormous distance. And he gets probably the best turn in the deck for him, really. So his opponent does have some straights here. I mean, 6-7 is potentially a combo. Queen Jack, you know, in the Queen Jack 10, but that could have considered raising flop. And Jack 7's really, really weird if someone has that. No, we also block the Queen Jack to a point. Plus, you know, for all our opponent knows, we have that in range, and we happen to have turned the equity of a flush draw. So I'm betting this turn. And it's about as good a turn card as we can ever dream to see. As it is, John goes for the check. Yeah, I mean, I think he needs a bit of a plan on what bluff cards he should be using, and I would have thought that the turn was about as good as he could have. So I think he just needs a general feel for what. I mean, again, it could just be because his players kept calling everything, in which case, you know, maybe that's influencing his decision making here, which again I can kind of understand. But you know, in a vacuum, you know, if we were playing a general player, like in the population and not an outlier, as this person might be, then we'd be betting this turn. So we reverse set. Opponent bets, which we're not a fan of. He certainly can have some straights here. That being said, he's also going to bet a pretty wide variety of two-pair combos. You know, 10-9, 10-8 spring to mind. I would expect 8-9 to raise flop, but you know, he's playing very fishy, so potentially that's even there. You know, we have a set. We can never raise and extract value, but we probably have the perfect bluff catching hand, so we should probably just go ahead and call and sigh if he happens to show it better, which unfortunately he does. So we're going to skip forward a few seconds. And John's going to make a pretty, it's bottom of range on right hand table for the button open. You know, hands like 9, 8, 7, 4 are definitely going to be in there when they're single suited, but this is just about okay. There's a couple of hands going on simultaneously here, so we are going to focus on one and then kind of like, you know, rewind and focus on the other. So we're going to focus on the left hand table, the ace, jack 10 5. Totally cool with this open. You know, we're a fan of it. And we get a pretty disastrous flop, to be truthful with you. And John decides to c-bet. Now, I'm not really a fan of this c-bet, to be honest with you. You know, okay, we do have some queen x's in our range, and if he expects to just bet pick up, then that's fine. But the players he's playing seem to be calling pretty wide at this point. You know, maybe that's them in general, or maybe they're sort of like picking something up on John that maybe he's just like he's overplaying certain hands. Excuse me. And I would be adjusting to that, I think. This would be a good spot to check back. We can turn straight equity, we can turn flush equity, you know, we can potentially turn an ace and be moderately okay with it. So yeah, our opponent's going to go ahead and call, I believe, if it's the hand I'm thinking it is, and my notes seem to confirm it is. And we get a 3 on the turn, which John elects to check. Now, I would be betting this, and some reasons why. First off, you know, in terms of pure equity, you've managed to turn a flush draw and a straight draw, and if you're bluffing flop, you know, what more are you really hoping for? Secondly is, you know, our button range can be reasonably wide. It's not a case of like we've raised under the gun +1 or anything crazy like that. We can have hands here that hit this range. Now, there's not an enormous number of them, but they do exist. Also, it's kind of difficult for our opponent who's calling under the big blind to really have many two-pair combos here. He can certainly have queen x. You know, the only thing that we're really worried about is like a queen x with a flush draw, which again is a reasonably small part of range. So, you know, our opponent can quite likely have, you know, medium strength queens, which don't improve on the 3, so we're going to get a reasonable number of folds versus them. You know, and we still have the equity of potentially hitting the 4, potentially hitting the flush draw, or possibly even being able to hit the ace and that being live. So this would be a turn I would be betting here. Okay, we don't have enormous range advantage, but you know, if we have the plan of betting flop, I think we need to continue on cards like this, much like in the Queen 8 5 5 board. So yeah, I would be betting this spot. He likes to go for the check. Unfortunately, board bricks out, and now he's in a spot where basically he can't bluff. You know, six is a particularly poor card. It's far less likely to be in his range, and he's going to get called by just about every queen X, which his opponent's kind of repped. And fast forward, it's going to go check, check, and our opponent is going to show up with a pair of nines. And that's just kind of illustrating just how wide someone's going to be betting, going to be calling, sorry. So if we are planning to c-bet, we really need to have a plan of how to take them off those kind of hands on turns and rivers. And you know, we should be, again, I would be making a note that this player had defended this loose and adjusting accordingly. So I'm just going to rewind it for the ace queen 8-4 spot, where John decides to go for a 3-bet. So we just rewatch this spot. Cool. Yeah, so we get the ace queen 8-4 double suited. Yeah, John goes for the 3-bet here. I think this is a perfect hand to just call with, to be honest with you. You know, okay with three-handed, and it is a button raise, but it's actually not going to have such good playability post, just because the hand's kind of a bit discoordinated. Yes, we have the suitedness. You know, the high card status, is it really high card, given we've only got 2 high cards? You'd kind of give that a 0.5 out of 1 if you're going to get, you know, rate on the 3-10 kind of scale. You know, as to suitedness, high card, and connectivity. You know, is it connected? Again, I mean, really iffy as to whether it is. So it's really only ticking the suited box. So it's an absolutely fine defend. I think he's 3-bet a bit too wide here. You know, I put in my notes that I'd much rather be 3-betting a hand like Queen 10-9-8, which you know, is definitely going to be a 3-bet when double suited in position. Out of position, it gets significantly ropier, and we should be 3-betting far wider in position than we are out of position. You know, that's just a general thing at poker. You know, far be it from unique to Pot Limit Omaha. You know, and obviously we'd be adjusting raising ranges depending on where the raise came from. You know, if there's a 6-handed game and we're getting raised under the gun, we're not going to be 3-betting a queen high hand. But, you know, something like cut off when we're on button, it would be fantastic for a 3-bet. And that's just because it's going to play so much better. And we're going to touch on that in a hand in a couple of minutes where we ran the maths. And yeah, it's a very similar spot to this. As it is, John's basically flopped as perfect as he can with top pair, gut shot, and nut flush draw. So just bet, you know, if someone wants to play for stacks here, oblige them. You know, he might get played back on occasions because it doesn't really hit his 3-betting range. So maybe get someone to overplay something like jacks, which is a big favorite over. As it is, just bets pick up, which is, you know, not again. I mean, anytime you win money without having to face any risk is, you know, reasonable result. So it's far from disastrous. So left on the table, we've got the Queen 9-7-5 single suited. John's going to go for a button open. It's absolutely fine. And he is going to get a big blind defend from memory. And yeah, so I think this is also kind of like falls into the category of how wide are we willing to go? John has decided to bet bottom pair here without really any blockers. I mean, the 7 of spades, but it's really not a blocker in this instance. And he's betting into someone who's just kind of got a bit stationary with a pair of 9s. So I really don't see how this is going to work all that frequently. I would just be checking, trying to turn 2-pair, trying to turn trips, you know, trying to get to share as cheaply as possible while improving. He's going to face a raise here and just have to snap forward, which, you know, is not the best result, frankly. But this would be a spot where I think he's just got a bit aggressive. Okay, he keeps his range wide by betting, but, you know, his opponent is calling stupidly loose, so it's not really going to be a particularly great spot. So a couple of hands going on again. The right-hand table, the ace, you know, low-suited ace, totally fine with the open. He can either check the flop and sort of pot control, or he can bet. He's going to have significantly more aces than his opponent, but it is obviously somewhat coordinated. You know, his opponent can have jacks with straight draws, queen 10-9s, flush draws, that kind of stuff. You know, king queen 10, that kind of range of hands. So yeah, he should be moderately cautious. And he goes for the 3-bet with the ace queen 7 deuce. And yeah, this is another one where it's not going to play as well post flop as, you know, a hand like the queen 10-9-8 that we've been talking about, and we're going to illustrate that with some maths in a point in a minute. So again, fine with just calling. It also gives the calling range a bit of strength, and you know, this is kind of like, it's not so playable post flop, and it's obviously a disaster if we happen to get 4-bet. On the right hand table, he's gone check check on turn, which I totally agree with. On the flush comes in, you know, he's going to get a tiny bet here. You know, he hates the bet, but frankly, when he's getting a gajillion to 1, he just has to call and probably see a better hand. But, you know, there's the odd chance someone's overplaying ace queen, etc. So John does get 4-bet with the ace queen, which is, not going to be a particularly good result for him. We're just going to illustrate this with some odds oracle sort of maths here. So we're going to illustrate, you know, how the two hands, you know, I was talking about the Queen 10 9 8 double suited and why I'd be three betting that and how that would play, you know, versus the hand John actually had. So we're going with someone on an 8% range. Again, you know, if you have odds oracle or any other tool that's similar, you can play about with ranges and see exactly how that, you know, how this would work. I mean, you see the flop equity distribution is reasonable, but when we actually compare it to the Queen 10 9 8 that we talked about, I mean, firstly, it's got a slight advantage in equity, but the main thing to talk about is that it's flopping smoother. You know, it's got a better flop equity distribution. Now it's by about, you know, 7 or 8 points, but it's that is going to make a big difference to your win rate. The fact that you can continue and you can make decent hands, and you know, the Queen 10 9 8. Okay, it's not quite hitting the high card scenario, but it's got the suitedness and it's got the connectivity. So it's hitting 2 of the tenants, whereas this is not really hitting any of them other than the suitedness. Really, I mean, the high cards. Okay, we've got 2 of them, but you know, that's not fantastic, and it's certainly not connected. So John is going to go for a you know, fold, I believe. I think it's a good fold, to be honest. He's crushed by a 4-bet range, so we're a fan of the fold. And this is the kind of hand that I would be advocating 3-betting double suited when we're in position. You know, I think for raising heads up single suited, this is you know, a very good raise. You know, it plays pretty well post flop. It's got potential. He continues on a board where he is going to flop far better than his opponent. Big fan of that. He has a lot of potential anyway with his Queen Jack 10 draw. You know, so he's doing reasonably well on this board. And he happens to turn the nuts and have 2 pair for a redraw to a full house, although that's probably not a redraw that in all probability he wants to hit, but it does exist anyway. And he is going to decide to size quite large on this turn bet. And yeah, he's going to bet 420 and sort of, you know, just frankly go too large. If you think about what range we have here, we're obviously going to have some straights, but we're also going to have a good number of sets and 2 pairs. And those should be somewhat wary of the queen coming off, you know, just because there's going to be a good chunk of straight draws on this board. So if we're meant to be wary of the queen, why are we sizing up so large on it? You know, even against a fish, I would still be advocating sort of betting more like 320. You know, pricing him in and then, you know, trying to get a stubborn call on river. As it is, I think he's just got a bit greedy here, which is understandable given he's playing someone who's not the world's greatest player, but still. Left-hand table, pretty standard open, not much needs to be said about that. And yeah, he is going to flop the top of sets and going to be continuing on here. He does backdoor flush draw and a gut shot to the nut straight. You know, I think when his opponent just calls here, he's basically capping range, saying that he's, you know, on the 2-pair type range, in which case John's going to continue betting and, you know, just attempt to extract value off, you know, potentially worse sets, potentially 2 pairs. And this is why we're playing hands with really high card potential, because, you know, we can find scenarios where we cooler someone with a center to set scenario with a higher 2-pair, etc. You know, when it's checked to 3 times, you know, I quite like the river bet, especially against someone who's been playing really stubbornly in terms of their calling range. We're only really value earning ourselves against 10-9, and I think the number of times we can get called by hands like, you know, King Queen, although we do block that to an extent, Queen Jack, King Jack, sets. You know, I think we're doing okay by betting. I wouldn't size much larger than this, but it's absolutely fine. The right hand table, the King 10-6-4, totally cool, open, totally cool, bet with bottom 2, and he's just going to check through on a pretty disastrous run out, which is a-okay in my book. And yeah, just folding on that horrendous run out when we get potted by a fish, pretty standard. And you know, he shows a bluff, but I mean, to be honest, like, fish are going to do some random stuff sometimes, and we're not really thinking from a results orientation point of view. We're just thinking from like playing the percentages, and you know, that small percentage of the time they're going to show up with a bluff, then muzzle tough, congratulations to you. But you know, we're playing the vast majority of the time, not being results orientated. And you know, if someone's bluffing 10% of the time, but they're going to have a value hand 90% of the time, then you know, we can't really be too shook up about the 10% of the time they show up with a bluff. You know, sure, well played, whatever. Move on with your life, and just continue to value own the guy when you have the value hand. So he decides to just check here, which I think is a-okay. Checks flop. I mean, you could potentially even lead here if you wanted to. Leads turn, when check to, it's such a small pot, it doesn't really make much of a difference, but I'm probably just potting here to be totally frank. Gets a pretty horrendous river. He's going to be checking through. If he gets it to showdown, there's a chance he's good. If he gets bet into, it's pretty disastrous. There is a good chunk of 10x. His queen jack happens to be good. Pretty happy with that result, I'd imagine. And yeah, 10-10, 9-4. This is okay in a heads-up scenario. I think on button in a six-handed game we would be folding this just because of its rainbow nature and not playing particularly well. But in this particular instance, it's fine. He's going to go for a check and turn the absolute best card he can imagine. And I'd imagine at this point he's just going to start going for value, which is exactly what he should be doing against this type of player. But obviously when he turns that good, he should be doing it anyway. Queen Jack gets there, small consideration, would still go for value, snap fold. And that's going to complete the hands that John has sent me. So yeah, we're just going to touch on some overall thoughts just to wrap up. The first thing, I've recorded this fourth part of the video after John has seen the first part of the video, so I got a little bit of feedback from him. The first thing he kind of touched on was one of the first points I made in the first video about bankroll management, the fact he should be playing lower with more buy-ins. He agrees with that, so just a general point about bankroll management, but he seems to have taken that board anyway. The second point is in general play tighter. He's shown up with some kind of weird random hands on occasion, so sort of just removing that kind of junky part of range is definitely going to show a good profit. He seems to have a reasonably good post-flop game. With a few exceptions that maybe, just cut out some of the more crazy stuff. But it's his pre-flop game that's really kind of the issue. And by strengthening his pre-flop game, not only is he going to tighten things up and improve his win rate that way, but it's going to have a knock-on effect on his post-flop game. If you're playing a stronger range post-flop, you're probably going to make better decisions, just because you're more likely to be drawing to nut hands. And, you're not going to be in horrendous spots where decisions are really marginal on the razor edge. So making an effort to work on his pre-flop game is actually going to have a really good knock-on effect on his post-flop game as well. A lot of people sort of talk about Omaha as a post-flop game, and that's true to an extent. But when with pre-flop, we can really alter the stack-to-pot ratio, and the stack-to-pot ratio post-flop has a huge impact on it. So the fact that we can alter that pre-flop really then does impact the post-flop game. So that's something we should be really mindful of. I think also he needs to refine his 3-bet range a bit. There's some overplays with some weak suited aces. I would cut those out, put in more connected double suited kind of stuff. Just because it's going to play much better and defends versus 4-bets as well. It's just going to show better profit really. I wouldn't be overvaluing some pairs overvaluing some hands in position in multi-way spots. We saw him do it in the previous video with the bottom pair in 5-3. I think we've seen it in a couple of other instances where he's fired into 3 or so people that check and got himself in some pretty ropey spots. Again, there's nothing wrong with just checking, taking one off, and then evaluating, what the turn card happens to be. I think also have an idea of what he wants from a hand pre-flop, or just in general, really. Do you think it's a pushing or a pulling hand, and how that would impact how you play it? Does it have front end or back end nuttiness? And what I would mean by that is it likely to make sets and 2 pairs? Is that where you're aiming to get out the hand? In which case, it's going to make the nuts on the flop, but suffers somewhat from turns and rivers, just because straights and flushes start coming in. So you really want to pile money in pile money in on the flop as much as you can, and also the stack to pot in that aspect. Or does it have rear end nuttiness where it can make the sets? It can make straights, can make the flushes. It has rear end nuttiness, in which case, you can then alter the SPR to suit that as well. Yeah, so I think in general, his post-flop game is reasonable, and I think that's partly because he's played so much Hold'em, and the general point that he understands ranges, he understands a lot of Hold'em concepts, some of which are applicable to Omaha, and just has a general feel for the game. But the pre-flop aspect is where I think he should really kind of focus his attention on and really sort of nail down. So yeah, I'll be following his progress on the forums. Definitely wish him well in both these challenges on Betfair and BetSafe. Hopefully he takes some of this on board and really kind of finds it constructive. I know the first video he kind of said was a bit brutally honest, but he was happy with it. Yeah, it might have been a bit brutal, but to be honest, I'm probably happier if someone was completely brutal with me. It means I get more out of it. If someone sort of tries to be soft, then they might necessarily miss a few things and, kind of like cost me money through kindness in later weeks and months. I think the main point about anything, whether you take coaching from whoever, is that it's constructive. criticism. You know, criticism that's, you know, just like, hey, you're terrible, is completely useless, and the guy's like, yeah, whatever for calling you that. But like, if it's constructive criticism and serves a purpose, you know, then treat it in the way that's intended. And you know, okay, you might be a bit moody about someone being brutal for a few hours, but when you see the benefits of it long term, you know, you're probably actually very thankful that they did what they did. So yeah, this wraps up the last part of the video. I realise it's run quite long, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff in some of these videos, and I'd rather be a bit more exhaustive than gloss over things and produce, you know, a far worse product at the end of it. So yeah, I wish him best of luck in these challenges, and I've been Tom for Poker VIP.